All right, welcome to Cwic Show. In this episode, we're going to talk about the gospel on the Nile. This is the first set scheduled trip for Cwic Trips in 2023, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing and why I think it is such an important message that is going to be given in this trip. We are going to be cruising up the Nile. Now, what that means is we're going from the north to the south. And that's important to understand the distinction of the two Egypts that there are. There is Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. They are designated based on the directional flow of the Nile. So, since the Nile flows from the south to the north, going upriver means you're heading south. So, southern Egypt is Upper Egypt. And then, of course, if you're going down the Nile, you're heading north. And therefore, northern Egypt is Lower Egypt. So you base that off of the Nile. But there are so many connections in the gospel and in the scriptures to Egypt that we don't realize. And this becomes a very faith-building, testimony-building trip that emphasizes these connections and primarily emphasizes our experience in the temple. I believe that there is no better way to learn about the temple outside of going to the temple itself than to study and visit Egypt and the ancient Egyptian religion. And there's some very good reason for that I'm going to go into in a minute. But I want to talk about these connections first. Of course, you go back and you've got Abraham. The book of Abraham talks of Abraham, as does Genesis, of Abraham heading south to the northern border of Egypt and living in Egypt for several years, where he is teaching the Egyptians in the Pharaoh's court about, and I'm doing air quotes here, about astronomy. Well, you learn about astronomy in the beginning of the temple, right? This is there's astronomy, there's the creation story, there is, and of course, we soon learn in Abraham that in his vision, he's going to go through the creation story again in the Adam and Eve story. And so astronomy is very strongly tied to the temple and the cosmology of the temple and the gospel. And then, of course, several years later, his great-grandson, Joseph, is sold into Egypt, lives in Egypt, rules Egypt. And this becomes the beginning of a very strong legacy that ends up with the Latter-day Saints. Joseph, of course, as a ruler in Egypt, keeping his own scriptural records, would have kept those records in Egyptian. It becomes the language of Joseph. And where does he hand these records to? Where do they go? Well, they would go to his heir, Ephraim. And then you go down the line of descendants here. You get to Joshua, who's an Ephraimite after Moses leaves. Joshua is the one that brings the children of Israel into the land of Canaan, into the promised land. He has a sword that he is using, very possibly Joseph's original royal sword that would have been handed down to him. And then we come down to the time of Lehi. Well, let me back up a little bit. And then you get the two kingdoms, right? You've got all of Israel that King David is over, and then Solomon is over, and then you have a breakup of the two kingdoms, and you end up with the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. But that northern kingdom of Israel is also called Ephraim and even Joseph sometimes. Why? Because the rulers of the northern kingdom are Ephraimites, and they're likely making a claim back to Joseph for their royal blood, and possibly, very possibly, for a patriarchal priesthood. Whether they actually had it or not, they could be making a claim on that. And so you end up with the northern kingdom of Ephraim, the northern kingdom of Israel. Well, this, of course, is where Lehi's family would have been. his ancestors would have been, and he might have even been for a time, but more likely it's his ancestors that are in the northern kingdom in the territory given to the tribe of Manasseh. And they may have came down during the siege of the Assyrians over Samaria and all of the other parts of the northern kingdom. Well, you get down to the time of Lehi then, and where does he get the brass plates from? He gets the brass plates from Laban. If you look at second-hand accounts, for example, of a man named Bishop, who is a friend of Martin Harris, Bishop says that Martin Harris, who was the scribe of the lost 116 pages, and had those 116 pages with him, traveling from Pennsylvania back to New York, and however long he held on to that manuscript, he had a very good knowledge, having transcribed those 116 pages and held on to them and traveled with them for quite some time, of what the content was in there. Bishop says that Martin Harris told him that Laban was an Ephraimite. And therefore, if you follow Joseph of Egypt, who would have been writing his own scriptural record and then handing that down to his heir, Ephraim, happened to be the younger of the two sons with Manasseh, and then handed down, perhaps down maybe his sword and his scriptural record down to Joshua and so forth, down through the kings, and then eventually down to Laban, who also would have had ancestors that would have fled the northern kingdom and arrived in the southern kingdom of Judah. That would explain Laban's position in the army. He may not be a Judahite directly with the royal Judahite blood from the tribe of Judah, but he would have had royal blood, so to speak, directly from his Ephraimite ancestors. And he obviously held on to the record of the brass plates that, according to Bishop, through Martin Harris, was the original scriptural record of Joseph and others who kept writing in that record. And we know in the Book of Mormon, it tells us that those brass plates were written in Egyptian. So this becomes, for the tribes of Joseph, being Ephraim and Manasseh, their spiritual language to write in. They write in Egyptian. That explains why Lehi and Nephi write in Egyptian. So when they pull the brass plates with them, they have a very clear understanding of how to read this Egyptian. And then, of course, they're going to write their story, their history, in the same language, in the language of Joseph. Right? And if you go through the beginning of First Nephi, you see all of this talk about Joseph, this additional information about Joseph of Egypt. Well, this is coming from the brass plates, more than likely. Right? There's vision there that Nephi has, but there is more there. And that would make the brass plates not just the Old Testament. We shouldn't look at it that way. The brass plates are not the Old Testament that we have today. It had many of the Old Testament books, but it is a Joseph legacy, a Josephite legacy, not a Jewish legacy from the tribe of Judah. And so there would have been different prophets in there. You've got Zenock and Zenos and Nahum, right? These are prophets that would have been likely from the northern kingdom and from a different heritage than what we have in the stick of Judah, right? We're talking about the stick of Joseph. The stick of Joseph would also be the brass plates, not just the Book of Mormon, because this is what the Nephites are using to write the Book of Mormon. They are pulling from the Egyptian brass plates. And then, of course, Joseph later on is going to have his connection with the mummies and the papyri, including the facsimiles, the Book of Breathings, and other items that he encounters and buys, and that triggers the translation of the Book of Abraham, whatever that means, translation, right? And this connects us in so many ways as Latter-day Saints back to Egypt through Joseph. I think that's a really strong heritage that we discount or are ignorant of in many cases. We can go back again. You had Abraham there in Egypt, and then you have his great-grandson Joseph. Well, later on, you have Uriah in the book of Jeremiah, a prophet who is slain, right? But before he's slain, he runs off to Egypt. They find him in Egypt, they bring him back, and they kill him. Jeremiah is not killed, though they want to kill him. So many want to kill him. But after Jerusalem is taken by King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, Jeremiah is spared. Remember, Jeremiah was supporting the Babylonians and not the Egyptians. He was supporting the Babylonians, that's where their alliance needs to be. King Zedekiah, though he was put in as a puppet king to King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians, ends up siding with the Egyptians. And regardless of Jeremiah's preaching, where does he end up going for safety? He goes to Egypt because there is a large contingent of Jews in Egypt. There always have been in numerous different settlements that we know about through archaeological discovery and records. And he doesn't end up there for very long. We don't know how long, but he's not forever, right? He ends up coming back up to Canaan. But that's another connection there. And then you come down to the time of Jesus. And after Jesus is born and Joseph learns about the plans of Herod, where does Joseph take Mary and Jesus? To Egypt. Why? Because there are friendlies there. Right? He's going to take them where there are friendlies. You had a very large contingent of Jews in Alexandria and other settlements there. At one point, you had Jewish temples, Israelite temples in Egypt. There was one in Upper Egypt in Elephantine. There was a Jewish settlement there. You had also one from, I think it's Oneida, the Temple of Oneida, which I believe is in Lower Egypt. And I think there's one other that they found as well. So you had actual temples, Jewish temples in Egypt as well. So you have all of these connections there. And then you go back and you read the book of Abraham at the beginning, and you understand that the ancient Egyptian religion is an imitation of the patriarchal priesthood and their temple. When we say the patriarchal priesthood and their temple, we're talking about Adam. We're talking about Abel, right? We're talking about Enoch. We're talking about Methuselah and Noah. Here's what chapter 1, verses 25 and 26 say of the book of Abraham. Verse 25. Now the first government of Egypt was established by Pharaoh, the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham. And it was after the manner of the government of Ham, which was patriarchal. Now, what does the government mean? Well, of course, we're talking about theocracies. We don't think about that in our governments today because they're separated. Church and state are separated. They weren't separated back then. So you're talking about the government. You're talking about the makeup of the church and the priesthood. So the government of Ham, which was patriarchal. Verse 26, Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate that order or priesthood, right? That's a DBR word, that order established by the fathers in the first generations, in the days of the first patriarchal reign, even in the reign of Adam and also of Noah, his father, who blessed him with the blessings of the earth and the blessings of wisdom, but cursed him as pertaining to the priesthood. Okay, so Pharaoh, being a descendant of Ham, does not have the priesthood, but he is going to imitate it as best he can. So even more than what we may have had with actually the Temple of Solomon. Now, of course, there would have been more knowledge there if we would have actually been able to see that or been able to uncover it archaeologically. But even more than that, you have a patriarchal priesthood. with patriarchal endowment happening in Egypt, imitating the righteous order given by Noah, the patriarch. And so that's why I say when you look at their ancient religion of Egypt, you have things like the ritual embrace, which we would recognize as something that's happening at the veil. You have the idea of endowment, going through an endowment and progression of degrees and becoming like the gods, which is really what you're looking at in the facsimiles of the Book of Abraham, right? 1, 2, and 3. Sacrifice and death, fall, the plan of salvation in the second facsimile, and then the coronation of Abraham / Osiris in the court of Pharaoh, on the throne of Pharaoh there. And so all these things are brought together when you pull in the ancient religion of Egypt. So there is this closeness that we don't usually emphasize of Christianity, and especially the restored gospel with Egypt, that is focused not just on the connections that I've gone over here, but primarily set in the temple. And then we even have, in the West and in the United States, you have these connections. Look at the Washington Monument, the obelisk, which is in Washington, D.C. That's Egyptian. What about the Great Seal of the United States on the dollar bill? A pyramid with the all-seeing eye, right? There are all these connections that are brought together that we cover on this tour, on this cruise up the Nile, which means we're going from the north to the south. Now, where do we go with this? We start in Cairo. We go down to Luxor / Thebes. This is where we get the papyri and the mummies in that area there, and the Valley of the Kings there also we visit. But that's where these things are coming from that we get for that Joseph Smith had. We go to Edfu and Aswan, where we visit temples, and we go through and you see the hieroglyphs and the images, and you learn about the rituals and the endowment and the embrace and many other things. It's fascinating. Again, I think outside of the temple itself, there is no better place to learn about the temple and to enrich your temple experience, to give it real context, than studying and visiting Egypt. So we'd invite you to come along with us. I'll cover a little bit more on this topic as we go through the following months here. But if you're interested in seeing more about this and learning more about this Gospel on the Nile cruise, you can go to cwicmedia.com, cwicmedia.com. Up above at the navigation, go to Cwic Trips, and then scroll down to the Gospel on the Nile. I think you'll like what you see. Thanks for listening.